It's the fourth or so in a series of webinars we're doing this fall. And this one we're going to be focusing on the role of race in immigration policy and immigration policy making, and sort of the larger questions surrounding migration and race. One of the impetuses for it obviously was sort of the events in the spring and over the summer. Race has become, again, a front and center feature of American life. It has been for a long time, as we'll see today, when we look at immigration policymaking, which is not just simply a contemporary phenomenon, but race has intersected with that issue, so to speak, for a couple hundred years, really, since the founding of America, really. But we have some great speakers today, and they're going to really provide an opportunity for us to get a little bit better insights into race, the Catholic Church's sort of approach to the issue of race, and then its intersection with immigration policy. And I'm going to sort of give a brief background for each speaker in the order that they will be speaking today. First up is Danielle Brown. She's the Associate Director of the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Before coming to the USCCB in May of 2018, she helped to co-found and lead one of Renewal Ministries' first young adult discipleship chapters, and was a diocesan delegate at the USCCB Convocation of Catholic Leaders and the National Black Catholic Congress in 2017. Previously, she was an Assistant Deputy Legal Counsel to the Governor of the state of Michigan, and a three-time governor-appointed appellate administrative law judge there. Julia Young is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and received her PhD at the University of Chicago. Her prize-winning book, Mexican Exodus, Immigrants, Exiles, and Refugees of the Cristero War, examines Mexican religious exiles, political refugees, and labor immigrants in the United States during Mexico's Cristero War. And she's currently researching a new book about right-wing Catholicism in Mexico during the 20th century. Third will be Dylan Corbett, who is the founding executive director of the Hope Border Institute, which is itself an advocacy and action organization that applies the perspective of Catholic social teaching to the realities of the U.S.-Mexico border. Before that, he functioned as a staffer at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and CCHD, and he was here for several years. Many of you may very well know him from his time here, as well as his time at Hope Border. And finally is Abraham Hoven, who's the director of the Office of Advocacy for the Diocese of San Bernardino, which is responsible for advocating in favor of a wide range of issues of importance to the Church and activating local support in favor of them. AJ is also a published essayist and poet writing about the immigrant experience. And as you may all know, you probably do, or many of you do, he's also been very active in the JFI campaign for as long as I can remember. And he always has, steps forward and helps out whenever we need him. And, he's a great person we can turn to on the ground as an advocate. So on that note, I will turn it over to Danielle, who will launch this webinar. Let's I guess move ahead. Danielle, you can go.
Thank you so much. It's a blessing to be able to present to you today, and so I'll just jump right in. Ethnicity has long been a factor guiding migration policy in the United States, and I will leave the bulk of that exploration to the experts who will follow me, but suffice it to say that slavery most definitely informed the development of migration policy, as did the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that effectively barred Chinese migration to the United States. In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement became popular amongst political and scientific elite, and it was held up as science, wherein so-called biological principles were used to distinguish between people, their features, and who were to be perceived as superior versus inferior races. The United States Bishop in 2018 voted upon and overwhelmingly approved the document, Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love. That letter was really prompted by the racial disturbances that we would probably kind of deem as child's play as it relates to what we've seen in recent months. But there was significant unrest in 2014 and 2015 that sparked the beginning of this letter being written. There was a rise in extremist nationalist ideologies and xenophobic rhetoric that instigated fears against foreigners, immigrants, and refugees, the bishops write in their pastoral letter. Specifically in the letter, the bishops reject organizations that were founded out of racist ideology, calling participation in them or fostering them sinful. What we find in the letter is a format in the style of appalling exhortation, identifying the issue, applying Catholic teaching to the issue, and then exhorting the community. In the midst of this, we have to understand that this is not the first time that the bishops have spoken out against racism, but it is the first time in roughly 40 years, Brothers and Sisters to Us, which was written in 1979, was the most recent letter before this one. And so really diving in, Open Wide Our Hearts reveals to us through our bishops that the truth is very straightforward, and the bishops recognize that when one culture meets another, the lack of awareness and understanding that happens in that exchange often leads to value judgments that are distorted and prejudiced. And this prejudice fuels attitudes of superiority that are embedded in, reinforced by social structures and laws that are really the fruit of some of the laws that I spoke of a little bit earlier. The bishops especially recognize the fact that Hispanics have been the major target of immigration raids and mass deportation, and that even some of the people of Hispanic descent who were caught up in these raids were U.S. born, but have been deported nonetheless. They cite the fact that many Hispanics, even now, are assumed to be in this country illegally, and they observe that these attitudes cause a cultural superiority and an indifference and a racism to come forth that we need to confront. The bishops also recognize in Open Wide Our Hearts that a large part of our nation consists of immigrants and their descendants, and that we have to remember that specifically within the Hispanic heritage, there's much crossover between the Native and Indigenous people and those that we would commonly term Hispanic, and that many of the families that are brothers and sisters today were on this land long before borders were even established. Speaking of borders, this calls to mind our trip with the Migration and Refugee Services Office to the border with several bishops last year, where wisps of racism can be seen just walking down the street. But on a broader level, we have to consider where racism manifests today in migration policies, wherein certain groups seem to be selectively picked and chosen to be worthy of immigration rights over others. Within the U.S. bishops' listening sessions on racism that began in August of 2018, the bishops have been able to engage people who have firsthand experiences dealing with the problems that they face as immigrants, both inside and outside of the church, and the challenges they face when they have been mistreated by people and personnel within the church who they are afraid to then speak out against for fear of migration-oriented retribution. And we hear these stories, and we have heard these stories time and time again in our listening sessions. I'd like to speak just briefly about a visit I made to the Diocese of San Bernardino, since we have one of the diocese's sons on the line. I visited a group of priests, in fact, their priest convocation, where I was honored to address the entire body of priests and their bishops at their priest convocation. 75% of the priests in the Diocese of San Bernardino are actually foreign born. And the story within the story of our clergy as it relates to immigration is their challenges, both in navigating being able to answer their calls as missionary disciples in the midst of also having to navigate migration rules and regulations and congregations of people and parishes, and even in some scandalous situations, brother priests who do not welcome them when they come here because of how they look or how they speak. And my heart was broken by the time the convocation was over, because priest after priest after priest came up to me and shared with me the stories of how rejected he felt in his diocese or in his parish. And I won't go into how many degrees some of these priests had, but they are some of the most educated men I have ever met in my life. So these things are all things that we have to keep front and foremost in our minds when we discuss the issue of migration and immigration and racism, and call upon specifically the most recent exhortation of Pope Francis Fratelli Tutti, wherein he says, every brother or sister in need, when abandoned or ignored by the society in which they live, becomes an existential foreigner, even though born in the same country. They may be citizens with full rights, yet they are treated like foreigners in their own country. Racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. And finally, we just advance the slide. It's called to your attention as you go forward and navigate how to discuss these issues with younger members of your church family and your biological family. The USCCB, through the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism, has produced a book called Everyone Belongs. It is awards season in the children's book land, and we have been blessed to have received three awards so far. I want to bring this book to your attention because it's based on the story of an immigrant family from Uganda who moves into a new neighborhood and the challenges that they face in the midst of living their lives as neighbors. Alongside of a really excellently illustrated and well-written book is specific lessons for children from K through grade 5 that you can download for free even before purchasing the book on the Loyola Press website. So those are just some things sort of whet your mental appetite, and I would yield to my esteemed colleagues on the call to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Really appreciate it. It's insightful stuff you have. I think next up is Julia Young. If you could advance the slide, Tony, so that she can take over from here.
Thank you. Hi there. Well, I want to thank everyone on this call, and thanks to Todd for inviting me, and to the Justice for Immigrants webinar series for having me as a speaker. So as Todd said, I'm a historian, so I'm going to give you a very quick and hopefully not boring history lecture with a lot of images, so you'll hear me say next slide a lot. But,
I'm sorry, Julia, I'm just trying to advance the slide, so go ahead and I'll hopefully get this going, so thank you.
Okay, that's fine. I'll if we can't have the images, I'll just describe them, but I'll tell you when we can, if we can, that'll be great. But so I wanted to talk about set up a way to draw comparisons between today and between a specific period in the past. So I want to say that today, as we all know, we're in a period of migration restriction, deportation, and immigrant criminalization, which is coming or sort of overlaps with an era of mass migration, which I would date from about 1965 until 2008. And that migration is still ongoing today, but we saw a lot of changes after 2008. And I want to talk today about the role of race in immigration policy during an earlier period, which was from about 1880 until about 1930. So how are we doing okay with getting the slides online, or is it still a struggle?
I'll get it on here. There's a little bit of a technical problem. I'm sorry. I apologize. We'll get it on here.
No, that's all right. Okay. Well, I'll talk and I'll describe the slides until we have them. So yeah, from the middle of the 1800s, so like let's say the 1840s or 1850s, until the end of the 1920s, the United States saw a massive migration from new areas in Europe as well as increasingly from Asia. This immigration really mushroomed after the 1880s. Only about 2.5 million Europeans entered the country in each decade between 1860 and 1880, but during the single decade of the 1880s, over 5 million Europeans arrived, and then another 16 million would enter in the next quarter century. And then the other thing is that the origin of those immigrants changed significantly after about the 1870s, with new waves of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, Russia, and then increasingly actually from Asia, especially China, instead of where they had come from before in U.S. history, which was Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia. So by 1900, almost 70% of all immigrants to the United States originated in regions and countries that included Austria-Hungary, Italy, Russia, Greece, Romania, and Turkey. So we're really talking about Southern and Eastern Europeans, many of whom, those coming from Eastern Europe, were Jewish. And then a new stream of immigrants from Asia. They're coming for a number of reasons, including a number of push factors in their home countries, which I won't really go into today. One of them was the transportation revolution, and here's where I would show you a slide of Chinese immigrants working on railroads. That was a huge attraction or a pull, what we call a pull factor for immigrants coming to the United States, especially to the West. And then another was industrialization in the United States. So here's where I would show you a picture of Italian immigrants working in what we would sort of perceive as a sweatshop. But increasingly the mechanization of various industries, especially the textile industry, was creating jobs and massive labor needs in the United States. And as these new immigrants came, they seemed markedly different to native-born Americans. They tended to cluster in cities. They tended to be particularly urban, and so cities like New York were sort of fundamentally changed. These new immigrants, you can think of the sort of tenement areas in the southern part of New York. These new immigrants lived often very densely. They often lived in conditions of poverty. And then on the West Coast, you saw the rise of a number of new Chinatowns. And I had a picture of San Francisco's Chinatown, which is obviously still there today, and many of you have probably seen it. And so these new immigrants were very visible. They looked very different, and they seemed to be particularly poorer than the native-born. And so concurrently, fears of immigration arose around the United States. And these I could talk about this more later, but these fears of immigration are sort of always present throughout U.S. history. And one example that a lot of Catholic audiences know about is the Know Nothing Party, which is formed by anti-Catholic and anti-Irish members of the working class during the 1840s and 1850s. So this 1880 period that I'm talking about is not the first time that there's an anti-immigrant sort of sentiment. But by the 1880s, we begin to see really widespread ideas about how these new immigrants, and sort of quoting, new immigrants are dangerous, they're dirty, they're bringing disease into the country, and this is really expressed in popular culture. And one area in which that's expressed is in political cartoons. So as we get to, I see some images. Do you want to? Could I just tell you to sort of flip forward through some of these? So this is kind of illustrating the points that I just talked about. The sweatshops. We can keep going, and I'll tell you when to stop. Indian immigrants, the sort of tenement areas in New York. You can keep going. Sort of poverty, Chinatowns. This is the Know Nothing flag, Native Americans beware of foreign influence. And then here we are, we can stop here for a second, and we start to see, especially in sort of popular imagery, and that's what I'll focus on today, these images that really that convey these very racist, racialized fears about immigrants. So the first sort of group that I'll talk about is Asian immigrants, who come to sort of represent this idea of a fearful difference. So that, and this, I won't talk about any one cartoon in great detail, but this one actually features an Irish immigrant and a Chinese immigrant, and they are consuming Uncle Sam. If we could go to the next one. So then we start to see images describing or expressing these fears of how are we going to keep these, we, the native born, going to keep these immigrants out. So here's the Know Nothing flag on top of a, quote, Chinese wall, and this is a wall that's supposed to be keeping Chinese out. If we can go to the next one, which is an image of the Chinese, cartoon about the Working Men's Party, with these sort of very racist, racialized portrayals of Chinese laborers. And the Working Men's Party comes from California and demands that the U.S. government cut off Chinese immigrants and limit the rights of the Chinese in the United States. And Danielle already talked about how ultimately the Working Men's Party helps lead to our first national level immigration restrictions, which is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So our very first federal immigration exclusion is directed against these Asian immigrants. And if we can go to the next slide, these racialized fears apply to the mass of migrants in general, including the European migrants. And Danielle already mentioned eugenics. So eugenics is this this idea that's widely accepted in popular culture as well as in intellectual and elite culture, where there's an idea of which races, and race is really thought of than the way we think of nationality. It's a little bit of a different way to frame it, but we think of nationality now the way people then sort of thought about race. So there are sort of common stereotypes about certain ethnic groups or nationalities being inferior to superior ethnic groups and nationalities, and you can guess which nationalities are supposed to be superior. It's the Anglo-Saxon, white, quote-unquote races that are in the United States as native born, and the inferior ones are the immigrants who are coming in. And so you see these sort of some of these images, which were really just endemic at the time, that cast immigrants as these very unsavory figures whose inherent attributes threaten the racial makeup and the stock and almost the health of the United States. And so I'll just go to the next slide. You can just see many cartoons sort of portraying immigrants as dangerous, like unwashed masses that are climbing over the walls of immigrant restrictions. Another idea, and you can see that this in this cartoon, is as immigrants as threatening the American laborer. If we can go to the next one. Again, sort of portraying immigrants as dangerous and listing their potential negative qualities. If we if you can advance the slide. Some focus on specific immigrant groups. So this one in particular is directed against Italian immigrants, sort of pointing out their potential negative attributes. And if you read not just cartoons, but also in just the public rhetoric of the day, there's just very explicit conversations in public media about immigrants and their supposed attributes. So, Italian immigrants are more likely to be criminal, Polish immigrants are going to steal from you, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all incredibly offensive, but it's important it's offensive even to repeat, but it's important to recognize how widely accepted they were. If we can go to the next slide. So these ideas also had found support in government and were actually advanced by the government. So by 1911, Congress's Dillingham Commission publishes a massive report that purports to study these negative qualities of immigrants and endorses the exclusion of immigrants based on race and ethnicity. So increasingly we have efforts to control the entrance of immigrants into the United States. We can go to the next slide. Most people know about Ellis Island and its role from 1892 to 1954 really as a way of controlling who is allowed to come into the United States, especially if we can go through to the next slide, through health inspections. And fewer people know about Angel Island, which is in the next slide, which was on the West Coast and existed from 1910 to 1940 and was a similar way of controlling migrants coming in on the West, especially Asian migrants. But more important than these physical spaces were laws. So I already mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and we start to see after 1882 a succession of federal restrictions on immigration. So I won't go through all of them, but in 1917 we have an Immigration Act that establishes a literacy requirement and a head tax on all migrants entering the United States. And the idea behind that is that it's going to target poorer immigrants, most of whom are coming from these quote-unquote undesirable locations. But that Immigration Act doesn't actually successfully restrict the number of immigrants, and so the major innovation in that regard was the quota laws of the 1920s, which really did manage to exclude migrants based on race. So if we can go to the next slide. Really this is inspired by the results of the Dillingham Commission study. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 restricts all immigration from Europe and European colonies, excluding most countries in the Western Hemisphere, so most of the American countries. And from each of the restricted European countries, immigration is limited to 3% of the number of foreign-born persons from that country who were, and this is complicated, but 3% who are resident in the United States at the time of the 1910 census. And the cartoon helps it, makes it easier to visualize what the law was intended to do. So really to create this kind of funnel limiting the number of people who can come from Europe. And this law starts to take effect but isn't fast enough for many. And so if we go to the next slide, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 sets even more explicit prohibitions against immigrants based on their nationality. It establishes a limit of 150,000 per year from Europe, prohibits Japanese immigration entirely. If we remember, Chinese immigration is already basically prohibited. And installs even more specified quotas that restrict immigration from any country to 2% of the number of foreign-born people from that country at the time of the 1890 census. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see a map of where those quotas took greatest effect. And you can see that Great Britain and Germany are still allowed or immigrants from Great Britain and Germany are still allowed to enter the United States in fairly large numbers. And if you look at Southern Europe, which is all white, you can see that only below 1,000 immigrants from each country are allowed to come in. So that's really where it's really Southern and Eastern Europe that are the most affected. So following 1924, immigration from Europe and immigration from Asia declines incredibly steeply. So from a high of over 800,000 in 1921, European immigration drops to less than 150,000 by the end of the decade. And so that's just in time for the 1930s and the onset of World War II and the mass genocide of Jewish immigrants, most of whom are in Central and Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see the fall off in immigration after the end of 1930 and how it really just there's this sort of cliff. And it takes decades to rise again. And if we can just go to the final slide, and this may be a little hard to see, I'm sorry about that, but this really demonstrates the composition of immigration before 1930 and after 1930, and the yellowish bits are the European immigration. And so you can see how that European immigration drops off completely and never really recovers. So immigration will pick up again after 1965, but the composition of immigrants changes completely. And I think just to conclude, what we learn from this period is, what is lost after migration policy, what is lost when we institute migration policies that are built around racism. We lose lives, we lose opportunities, we see tragedies happen. That there were people who tried to escape from the Holocaust that were turned away based on the racist laws of 1924. And I think these are tragedies that we certainly see echoes of today as we look at the news about once again family separation or the Muslim ban or any of the many policies that have been enacted, not just under the Trump administration, unfortunately, but also under previous administrations. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for bearing with me for this history lesson, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Julia. This is really sobering stuff you're talking about here in terms of history, and it shows you how these things aren't really new. But there's a lot going on today, and so what we want to do now is move from the historical to the more contemporary. And Dylan Corbett is going to take up and sort of talk a little bit about what he's seeing down at the border in relation to Mexico, Latin America, so on and so forth, and the southern border. So go right for it, Dylan.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Dylan. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Dr. Scribner. Thanks, Mr. Kube, everyone at Justice for Immigrants. It's great to be able to talk to you in the JFI community today. I don't have any slides. I was hoping to be able to talk to you on the screen, but I'm told I have a radio face, so this might be better. I'm really grateful to Dr. Young and her presentation, the way that she set things up, because there are a lot of parallels and resonances with immigration policy that's played out over the centuries in the United States, and how racism has been a part of that, really right from the beginning. It's a legacy that continues today. So I want to pick up just on two of those historical examples that she, two things from history. One of which she made mention of to tee up how racism continues to be instantiated in policy that we see today. Really in a major way, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we might proceed given the reality of the elections in less than 2 weeks. And so, what you've heard, everything that you've heard in Dr. Young's presentation, it continues to have weight and resonance today, particularly on the border. So I'm going to be talking from the perspective of the border and border communities. And I want to mention two things from history. There are really two signal examples of this type of racism as it's played out here in the border, and particularly here in Texas. I'm talking today from gorgeous Texas. In 1825, the land where I'm speaking to you for today, here in Texas, as you know, was part of Mexico, and it wasn't until 1835 that Texas began a war against Mexico and then became the Republic of Texas and ultimately part of the United States as one of the states. But by 1825, because of immigration from parts of the United States, the southeastern parts of the United States, into Texas, into here in this part of Mexico, 1 in 5 people was an enslaved African. And so the institution of black slavery was very consequential in a state like Texas. Now, in 1835, there's a Texas revolt, and then the Republic of Texas is proclaimed in 1836. Now, historians will tell you that probably the most significant factor in determining the revolt of Texas from Mexico was the fact that just a few years earlier, Mexico had banned the institution of slavery. And so that's very important in a state like Texas here on the border, because the origins of our state, the origins of the Republic of Texas, the origins of the state of Texas, were overtly racialized. And the historical reverberations of something like that continue to this day. Institutions like the Texas Rangers, institutions like the Texas National Guard, and even the U.S. Army, as they were deployed here in the border, were responsible for a real campaign of terror and disenfranchisement of people of color, of Mexicans and Mexican Americans here in Texas, that extended all the way up really into the latter part of the 20th century. One other example that Dr. Yuan touched on, the 1924 Immigration Act. The 1924 Immigration Act, of course, was the time that the U.S. adopted, explicitly adopted racial quotas as the framework for immigration policy. And if you look back at the newspapers, for example, of the time, at the cartoons that some of which you saw from Julia's presentation, this was a time of explicit, overt racism in our country and xenophobia. There was a desire to really turn off the siphon of immigration from places like Asia and specifically Japan, but also Southern and Eastern Europe. And now, Mexico was exempted from the 1924 Immigration Act. Mexicans were exempted from those racial quotas. And the reason was, of course, because of big ag interests here on the border that needed mano de obra workers in order to work in agriculture. And so they were exempted. But there was a compromise, and that compromise was the creation in 1924 at the same time of the U.S. Border Patrol. Again, in an environment, a policy environment, a social and political environment that are explicitly xenophobic and racist. And so the origins of that institution, an institution that has significant social and political influence here on the border, was created. Its origins were explicitly racialized, and the reverberations of something like that continue down to the present day. Now, fast forward to the current administration. The Trump policies, in total, or on the whole at least, the policies and actions of this administration, right from the beginning, were never intended and have not responded to actual policy gaps. There has been the pretext for what the administration has done, whether it's the crackdown on the border, or whether it's limitations on refugee caps, or whether it's things like public charge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were never actual policy gaps to which those things responded. There was never a crisis of criminality here at the border. There was never a crisis of unauthorized immigration prior to the Trump administration. The numbers of arrivals to the border continued to plummet under the previous administration, and actually the undocumented population, the percentage of undocumented folks as a percentage of migrants as a whole, had actually gone down during the Obama administration. So it's clear that what we've seen, this whole panoply of policies from the Trump administration, is really part of a politics of exclusion, a politics of xenophobia. And it was meant to shore up a political base. So it was politically motivated. Now we're talking about racism. So I want to define racism. I'm going to use the definition that's present in Bishop Mark Seitz of the Diocese of El Paso a year ago to commemorate the killing of 23 folks, mostly Latino, in a racially motivated attack here in El Paso. Published a pastoral letter on racism called Night Will Be No More, which you can find on the internet. But I want to use the definition of racism that he has in paragraph 14. He says, if we're honest, racism is really about advancing, shoring up, and failing to oppose a system of white privilege and advantage based on skin color. When this system begins to shape our public choices, structure our common life together, and become a tool of class, it's rightly called institutionalized racism. Action to build this system of hate and inaction to oppose its dismantling of what we call white supremacy. So that's Bishop Seitz. Now back to me. Now racism doesn't come out of anywhere. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's intended to subordinate certain classes of people in our country, whether it's African Americans or the Chinese or folks at the border, people of color, for a purpose. And whether that's, in this case, political, in the case of the Trump immigration policy, or whether it's economic. And so for me, thinking about the intersection of immigration and race, it's clearer than ever because of what we've seen in the last several years under this administration, but also this larger history to which it's connected, that our current immigration policies, the current immigration regime is really, for me, a case study in structural racism. Institutions, like the state of Texas, for example, which in the last several years has invested billions of dollars more than $1 billion in deploying law enforcement to the border under the false pretense that there's a crisis of criminality at the border because of migration, or institutions like the Border Patrol, which have been weaponized against communities like never before. It's not about individual agents, many of whom I know and respect. It's about the weaponization of these systems and institutions for political purposes. These agencies exercise enormous social and economic influence here in our border communities, and they've been weaponized as part of this broader politics of fear. This is all structural racism. And in the area of immigration, it's expressed principally in policies that criminalize migrants and that militarize our border communities. That's how we see it play out here in the border. Criminalization of more and more groups of people, criminalization, treating even asylum seekers now and refugees like they're criminals, and then militarizing our border communities with things like walls and the ever-expanding and bloating of immigration enforcement agencies at the border. 545, remember that number, 545. There have been 545 families that we cannot reunite because of family separation. This, to me, is the clearest example of the ramifications of a politics of exclusion, of racism. This is torture. This is a crime against humanity. We know that the separation of children was willful. It was calculated. It was meant to weaponize against vulnerable migrants at the border, the most sacred thing that they had, their family. And now the fact that we know years later that we still can't reunite hundreds of families, it points to the lasting and irreversible damage of this awful moment of moral darkness in our nation's history. We need to remember. We've got to fix this. We've got to make amends. We've got to end these strategies of deterrence against migrants in every form they take, criminalization and militarization. I want to quote one more paragraph from Bishop Seitz, Night Will Be No More. This is paragraph 18. He says, he calls out structural racism here, and he makes the connections between racism in our country broadly and immigration policy. He says, quote, our highest elected officials have used the word invasion and killer hundreds of times to refer to migrants, treated migrant children as pawns on a crass political chessboard, and have made of wall building a core political project. In Pope Francis's words, these signs of meanness all around us, the same deadly pool of sin that motivates the attack of migrants seeking safety and refuge in our border community motivated the killing of our neighbors in August 3rd. Sin unites people around fear and hate. We need to name and oppose the racism that's reared its head at the center of our public life and embolden the forces of darkness. So where do we go moving forward? I want to just lift a line from Fratelli Tutti, the new document of Pope Francis, where he talks about migration. This is from paragraph 37. He says, certain populist political regimes as well as certain liberal economic approaches maintain that an influx of migrants is to be prevented at all costs. So he puts his finger on the causes of this racism at the border. It's populist political regimes, it's that politics of xenophobia, and two, it's liberal economic approaches. We're on the cusp of elections. If Trump wins, we have to double down. We're going to have to double down and push back in defense of our migrant brothers and sisters, because there's going to be a mainstreaming of all the measures right now at the border that effectively sealed the border to asylum seekers. But in a new administration, if there's a new administration, there's going to be a temptation to be satisfied with with rolling back, the worst excesses of the Trump administration, to go back to the status quo ante. But even before the Trump administration, as you all know, immigration, because of what the Pope is saying in Fratelli Tutti 37, certain liberal economic approaches, the immigration was one of the most consequential in our world and in our country, one of the most consequential axes of inequality, driven by economic interests, and again, both at home and abroad. And this too is structural racism, and the Holy Father is putting his finger on it, signaling both political populism but also liberal economic models as drivers of racism and hatred and policies against migrants. So we need to be bolder. I think we need a Marshall Plan for Central America that's going to address the root causes of migration. We can't just roll back the worst excesses of criminalization and militarization. We need to address the environmental crisis in Central America that they themselves alone can't address. We need to address the crisis of criminality and deteriorating democratic institutions in those countries and economic conditions there as a result of our foreign policy choices, as a result of our addiction to drugs. We can't just go back to adopting criminalization and militarization light. And of course, we can't address the crisis of immigration in the Americas without leadership to address the worldwide crisis of immigration. There were less than 1 million arrivals to the U.S.-Mexico border. Less than 1 million folks were apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border last year. But there are currently 80 million people around the world who've been displaced. 26 million people are refugees. And we know that 1% of folks around the world are officially on the move due to conflict or persecution or things like climate change. And last year, only 1 million of those folks crossed the border. So this can't be handled except as part of a worldwide strategy. And for that, we're going to need bold and visionary leadership, and we're going to need folks like y'all at the grassroots pushing for something new, because we can't go back to the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Some really good insights from the border, and so I look forward and see what we can do. We're now going to move to our last presenter, AJ, who will talk a little bit about the Diocese of San Bernardino, what they're doing there, and then I think we should have a few minutes for questions in case people have any. So please type your questions into the chat box if you can. AJ, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Truly honored and humbled to be a part of such illustrious group of folks, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to maybe bring together some threads that I've picked up here, as well as provide some practical guidance or frameworks for folks to sort of work within. So I'm the director of the Office of Advocacy here in the Diocese of San Bernardino, which is in Southern California. We're not a border community. We're about 100 miles away from the southern border here, but we are a uniquely situated diocese when it comes to sort of immigration, based on the 2010 census and data from the UCR Center for Social Innovation. We know that our immigrant population here in the Diocese of San Bernardino, which comprises 2 counties and actually is one of the largest dioceses based solely on like square miles and the actual size, is very tilted towards immigrants, and it's also incredibly diverse. And so the role that I have at the Diocese of San Bernardino is also a unique one. I guess you would say that it's part sort of legislative advocacy work, as it would be implied in my title, but also the Justice for Immigrants work falls under my purview. And so I see it as sort of a mix or a meld between legislative advocacy and sort of organizing work. And so what that means is that I've sort of had to come at this question, or the questions of the issues of immigration in our current context, from both spheres. And hopefully I'll be able to sort of organize these things. And now again, I guess the paradox that I've learned in my short time doing this work is that organizing is messy. So I apologize if as I go through this is a little bit messy. And also a byproduct of my being nervous is that I tend to speak pretty fast. So please do tell me to slow down if that's the case. My background is in history and in politics, political science specifically. And so I tend to look at things in systems and within a historical context. So I'm really grateful for Dr. Young's presentation, being able to sort of provide a lot of context for us to draw from. And so what I wanted to sort of talk about is, what is our question of mission? What's the bird's eye view right now of where we are, and maybe sort of focus us on frameworks. And the first framework that I like to think about is, what is the question of mission for you right now as it relates to immigration, and maybe specifically looking at and not disentangling, but maybe sort of holding together and holding in your hand how race is necessarily intertwined with immigration. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and again, I'm not a history expert, but my understanding of the church, especially around the period that Dr. Young spoke about, the church in America and in particular on the East Coast, is that the church played a central role in the way that immigrants from those various pockets of Europe were able to find footing here in the New World. And what that means is that because so much exclusion happened during that time for these particular groups, Italians, Germans, Poles, during this period, and they did not have access to sort of the typical social, political, and economic resources and levers that they could use to find a footing. The church itself was sort of central to how people were able to survive. Parish schools were erected because people were denied access to schools or they could not afford good schooling. The parish became kind of a hub for resources, jobs. You know, people were largely excluded and carved out of your typical safety nets or ways for which to provide for your family. And the church was there for them. And I think that the church has that opportunity and largely does that work now. But I think that we're also challenged because I think that when we talk about systems of oppression and when we talk about, you know, sort of more broadly or more specifically how Ms. Corbett had presented just previous to me, how these things still resonate, how they echo into the present, we know that these systems also still provide us with a little bit of a difference. That even though the histories of immigrants have a lot of similarities, the nuances that exist are maybe also important for how we might be able to bring everything together. Because that's sort of the big question for me in my role, and I presume for folks that are at the parish or diocesan level, which is how do we call people together into solidarity to understand that this mission, providing justice, moving us towards a context or a framework that is beyond even accepting what was before where we're at now, as Ms. Corbett indicated, but really pushes us towards something new. How do we leverage our positioning in the community to be able to gather folks and then move us into a space, hopefully, of more justice that realizes, you know, the gospel truth. And so, you know, I think that when I look at our role here in the church, I think of us as gatekeepers. And, you know, for me, I'm an immigrant from the Philippines. I was raised in South LA. If you told young me, who was sitting in his parish pew in Hawthorne, California, that I'd be here, you know, providing a presentation on race and the church on behalf of the USCCB, I'd have laughed you out of my sight. It's not something that I can imagine. But the only way that this exists is because other people, other gatekeepers here found value in the work that I did and decided to open that door for me. And I think that when we look at systems of oppression, it can be very, very, very easy, and this is me speaking to myself here, to get discouraged at how big this machine is and how hungry it seems to be and how many lives it chews up. And I think that we often dismiss or minimize the amount of agency that we have immediate to us. One of the things that organizers I've heard tell time and time again is if you want to make a change immediately and concretely, the first places to look are the places in which the spaces in which you inhabit, where you are exhibiting privilege, and then disentangle yourself from those privileges. And one of those easy things to do is to look at your position as a head of a ministry, as a head of a diocesan office, as a head of a parish council, is to look around the table and ask yourself, who is sitting with me? Because, you know, we believe as Catholics in the concept of solidarity and in the concept of subsidiarity. And so if we're making rules or if we're designing programs or looking at ways in which we can be active and advocate for our people, but those people aren't seated at the table, are we truly providing a space for real change to take place? And it's a challenge. It's very scary because for some of us, maybe this was the only time we had access to being able to change and drive things as we've been inspired, by the gospel to do. And for some of us, we also recognize that we are genuinely trying to provide positive change. But if we're not drawing and asking from the communities that are most directly impacted by these issues, and we're not listening and accepting as truth their experiences and their wisdom and the way forward from them, then what we're doing is we're creating and possibly recreating paternalistic and unfortunately reform as opposed to the type of revolutionary change that we may need to see in order to ensure that we don't just backslide and that we're able to enter a new space of justice. And what does that mean when we draw people together? I think that what it means is looking first at your immediate community and understanding that there are going to be similarities and differences and holding both. I think that people of color here and marginalized classes of people in America are really good at working in those paradoxes, especially socially and politically. We understand that this is a country that both, I'm speaking specifically of the Filipino American experience and the relationship between the Philippines and America as a colony and America as an imperial power, is that we can hold two things to be true that seem oppositional at the same time. And when I think about the Philippines and America specifically, I think about how the Americans viewed the Philippines as a prized possession, but didn't view Filipinos necessarily as something to be loved. And we see that in the history of Filipinos in America, during the same time that we were looking at, I think just shortly after the 1930s, you saw lynchings in places like Watsonville, California, as Filipino farm workers were trying to move in there and trying to purchase land. You saw the Filipinos being involved in major political and social movements, kickstarting the Delano grape strike, with Larry Itliong and the other Delano Manong. And so we know that Filipinos have experienced the type of racist experiences, xenophobic experiences as our brothers and sisters from the South and as folks of color elsewhere in the nation. But we also know that those instances are different, right? Because Filipino Americans, again, just to use them as an example, are here largely because America was there. And we know that to be true of other different immigrant groups too. And so what I think is important and what is gleaned when we have other groups come together and be able to share their experiences and unique lived experiences, both as a group and then individually, is that we're able to then sort of craft ideas, understand a broader scope of the suffering and the pain that we have here in America. And I know that we're short on time, so I'm just going to try and wrap it up and hopefully provide some scriptural or philosophical frameworks that I've found useful when addressing folks on this. And the first is the use of the mystical body. Martin Luther King liked to talk a lot about the mystical body, and I think that resonates for us as Catholics because it is such a fundamental part of the way that we view the church, that the church is bigger than, that the church transcends borders, because unlike other forms of Christianity here in America, this one is an immigrant church. It was imported from someplace else. And the way that I like to view the mystical body is that if we recognize that one limb is not working properly, or one limb is in crisis, one limb is infirm, it hurts the entire body. Racism and xenophobia hurt everybody. I think I just saw something this morning that indicated that the cost of racism based on a study might be $1.6 trillion or $16 trillion. I can't remember where the decimal point was. But trillion is eye-watering. And that's besides the point of what Dr. Young indicated, which is the loss of life, the sheer loss of life that happens when racist rhetoric and racist policies take place. And, Mr. Corbett indicated in his presentation that we've got 545 families that are still unable to be reunited because of racist policy made manifest and enacted. I think that we're seeing the human cost right now. And then the final thing that I also like to do when it comes to sort of scriptural work is look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think the major lesson here is to recognize not only that we are called to bring some relief to the person, to our neighbor who's suffering on the road to Jericho, but rather that the price of that relief, the commitment of that relief is extreme, and it is necessarily a challenge for us to hold on to and to be a part of. Because the Good Samaritan wasn't held up as an example by Christ simply because he did no further harm to this person. And it wasn't because he just merely said, okay, well, I'm going to prop him on, make sure that he's off to the side of the road and he's safe in that regard. But rather, the Good Samaritan showed himself to be a true neighbor by pulling this person off of the road, giving up his seat on his own ride, delivering him to a hotel, washing and cleaning and caring for the wounds, paying for the stay, and then promising more if that amount was not to cover the full rehabilitation of this person. What this looks like is a full reconciliation of harms, and harms that were not the fault of the Good Samaritan. That there was no impetus here other than a true love, an outpouring of love for seeing their neighbor suffer. I think that we're called consistently, but especially in this moment, to a massive metanoia. And I think that message really, really helps to bring folks together. And so I guess just to conclude and to sort of wrap up, I think that we all have roles as gatekeepers in the communities and the places and the spaces that we occupy. And so the question is, what are you willing to give up? Who are you inviting? And how are they being made to feel welcome and protected in their spaces? You are empowered to bring so much change in your communities. And I just want to make sure that you leave today with that knowledge and that hope. And hopefully you're able to take that to your ministries, to your parishes, and to your communities. That's it. Thank you. Hopefully that made some sense.
Thanks so much, AJ. That's really helpful. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep people too long. We've been answering some questions in the chat box over your right, particularly for further resources. But I do want to at least throw one question out, and maybe we can close on this. And it's kind of open-ended to anyone who wants to answer it. You know, a lot of the people who are listening are sort of active on the local level. They're not necessarily, in centers of power per se. But they're very interested in these issues, and they work very closely on these issues. I'm wondering, can the speakers, if you have anything, to what extent does popular action have any sort of an effect changing sort of the egregious anti-immigrant policies in the past? Does it sort of like an active citizenry? Is there anything that actually effective, or is it all just like power dealing on the level of elites and those who actually can pull the levers of power? Can anyone talk to that or point to where maybe individual people can actually make a difference?
I can.
True.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Just really quickly. A thing that I like to talk about, because again, I think it can be really discouraging when you're talking about such a big problem as, white supremacy historically, or white nationalism broadly, and the threats that it poses to democracy and to our people, is talking about the ways in which major popular movements have made change. When I look at things like the Delano grape strike or the civil rights movement, you're talking about people that were entirely removed from the locus of power. But what they leveraged was both the moral question that was at heart in their position, and then a commitment to holding people accountable in that. The thing that we talk about, especially in light of the election and my work in faithful citizenship locally, is that I think sometimes we put too much focus on things like voting. And that's not to say that it's not important, or things like the legislative or the electoral process, not to say that's not important. But rather, I think that we would benefit from understanding that when it comes to advocacy and also sort of like the way change happens, we have to recognize that's maybe the very tip of an iceberg, a very big iceberg for ways in which people can get involved. And when you're looking at things like the civil rights movement specifically, the direct ask was among them the right to vote. So how do we explain then that paradox that voting is so important, and yet these people were able to make such a monumental change without even having access to the vote? And I think that's the hope, that's the question, and that's a pathway for us to look at. And so that's sort of a thing that I like to share with folks.
Great, AJ. Thank you. Julia, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah. No, those are all great points, and I would just kind of maybe just again pointing to history, and I talked a little bit about the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that really changed, sort of opened the doors again to immigration in a new way in the U.S. And really partly that came about because the immigrants and their children and grandchildren of the groups that had been excluded in the 1920s really began organizing and forming associations and leagues that and organizations that pushed back against discrimination against them in American society, and actually then lobbied for immigration reform. And it's not a direct line, but I mean just in general, the sort of activism that comes from collaboration among groups that are experiencing discrimination or experiencing racism or being pushed out or marginalized by our laws. I mean, it was so important then, and it's important again now. And I think, history doesn't. What do we say? That history repeats itself but doesn't rhyme. Like, I think immigration history is very cyclical in the U.S., and I think we can hope that even as this earlier wave of very restrictive and racist immigration laws was done away with, we can hope for a new for reforms, partly because of activism today. And I just want to say the other thing is, I'm a historian, and we're often, one of the things that we do is, detach ourselves from the present to write about the past, I guess. But increasingly, I have tried to attach myself to the present to become personally involved in advocacy for immigrants and immigration. And I've found that, just developing that on-the-ground experience has allowed me to talk to people in my own daily life who might be opposed to immigration. And I just hope that those kinds of conversations can make a difference, even though they're just it's a drop in the bucket. But so I have hope for the future, and I hope it's not misplaced.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate it. Does anyone else have Ellen or anyone else?
No, thank you. I agree to
Great. Okay.
subscribe to all that.
Yeah, thank you. This all sounds great, and I really appreciate. I just want to take an opportunity to thank the presenters for coming on board. To give us a talk. There's a lot of information. It should be posted on the Justice for Immigrants website once we get things squared away. And thanks to everyone for joining us. I really appreciate it, and look forward to. Hopefully, you'll be able to join us next week for our next webinar episode in the series, which will look at the development and restructuring of the refugee resettlement program moving forward, and hoping to sort of lift that back into its former glory, so to speak. But until then, thanks so much, and we'll see you next week, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.